In August 1965, the Prime Minister of a tiny island was crying on live television, in front of millions. His voice had broken. His eyes were full of tears. Hundreds of journalists from every corner of the world sat there, recording this moment. Lee Kuan Yew's tears weren't just from emotion, because he knew that this tiny strip of land, just expelled from the Malaysian Federation, was perhaps in the most difficult position in history. No natural resources, no farmland, not even enough fresh water, and surrounded by neighbors who didn't exactly wish it well. But 50 years after those tears, that small island would become one of the wealthiest countries on Earth, and the way it did it. Some would call it mad, some would call it genius, and some would call it outright immoral. That's exactly what I'm going to tell you about today. The story of Singapore, how a country with absolutely nothing rose to the top of the world in 50 years. And let me tell you something up front. Once you've heard this story, you'll never be able to say, without resources, there's no development again. Last summer, when I was heading back from a conference in Tokyo, I routed my flight through Singapore. The moment I stepped out of the airport, something caught my attention. Everything was immaculate. But this wasn't ordinary cleanliness. This was a cleanliness built into every corner of the system. Thought through. Designed. I got talking to the taxi driver at the airport, a man in his 60s who'd been born and raised there. "How did you create this kind of order?" I asked. He laughed. "We created it? It was created for us. But who's complaining?" That single sentence, honestly, sums up the entire story of Singapore. Now, take yourself back to 1965 for a moment. Singapore's population was 1.8 million. Its land area was smaller than a third of modern London. Its economy was almost entirely dependent on British military bases. When the British left, that income went with them. The neighboring Malaysia and Indonesia were both poor and looked at Singapore with hostile eyes. Indonesian President Sukarno openly called the island the last bastion of colonialism. So here's the picture. Small, poor, alone, and zero resources. What do you need to go from a place like that to the top of the world? Lee Kuan Yew's answer was simple. Rules. But very hard rules. Lee Kuan Yew was a Cambridge graduate, a lawyer, and he looked at the world with an extraordinarily pragmatic eye. For him, what mattered wasn't ideology, it was results. Does communism work? Use it. Free market? Use it. A mixture of both? Even better, use that. This approach formed the foundation of his leadership, and it was put into practice quickly and without mercy. First order of business. End corruption. In 1965, Singapore was one of the most corrupt cities in the region. Police taking bribes, officials running favors, the system rotting from the inside. Lee Kuan Yew made a move to change this that's still being debated today. Anti-corruption laws were tightened so severely that everyone, from the most senior minister to the lowest level clerk, became equally liable to prosecution. Not even his own cabinet was exempt. In fact, at one point he personally investigated his close friend and former cabinet member for corruption. The man took his own life before he could be arrested. When Lee Kuan Yew spoke about this years later, his voice didn't waver. "I had no choice," he said. "The system is bigger than you." Let's pause here for a second. There's really only one measure of whether a system is genuinely clean. Is the leader holding his own people to the same rules? In Singapore, the answer was yes. And that created something remarkable. Trust. Foreign investors saw this. The money I put here won't be stolen. Bureaucrats won't pocket it. Deals will be honored. So what did that trust lead to? Money started flowing, in very large amounts. But before the money could flow, something else needed to be solved. Singapore's geography comes into play here. This island, sitting right at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca, lay directly on the most critical sea route between east and west. A huge proportion of the world's traded goods pass through here. Lee Kuan Yew recognized this and made a very clear decision. We're going to put ourselves at the center of this traffic. Enormous investment went into port infrastructure. By the mid-1970s, the Port of Singapore had become one of the most efficient ports in the world. And that was the first domino. The ones that followed were even more surprising. The second domino, education. There's something I really want to highlight here, because this is exactly what gets skipped in so many development stories. In 1965, Singapore had 4 separate education systems: Chinese, Malay, Tamil, and English. Lee Kuan Yew made a controversial decision and declared English the mandatory common language. That decision is still debated today, because Chinese speakers made up the vast majority of the population. But without that decision, Singapore couldn't have absorbed English, the language of international business, this early. And without that absorption, why would the finance firms, banks, and law firms that arrived in the following decades choose Singapore? I have a Singaporean friend who works in finance here in London. Why do foreign companies find Singapore so attractive? I asked him once. He laughed and said, because we can speak both Asia and the West. We're not bilingual, we're bicultural. That one sentence captures the fruit of that controversial 1965 decision, 60 years on. The third domino, housing. And this is perhaps the least talked about but most deeply impactful part. In 1965, most Singaporeans lived in slum-like conditions, overcrowded, with no proper infrastructure. The government launched a massive campaign through something called the Housing Development Board, or HDB. Over the following decades, millions of homes were built. Today, more than 80% of Singaporeans live in these government-built homes. But here's what's surprising. These homes aren't grim. They're not Soviet-style gray blocks. They're well-maintained, properly serviced, linked to the metro network. And more interesting still, the government doesn't rent these homes. It sells them. So citizens become homeowners. And that property grows in value over time. This one move fundamentally changed the relationship between Singaporean society and the system. Because when you own something inside a system, you also work to protect that system. But now we come to the uncomfortable part. Because the Singapore story isn't just about clever policies. Lee Kuan Yew's government ran an extremely harsh authoritarian line. Newspapers were kept under control. Opposition parties were systematically weakened. Journalists and academics who criticized the government from abroad were dragged through the courts. Chewing gum was banned. Not flushing a public toilet carried a fine. And drug trafficking was, and still is, punishable by death. When Lee Kuan Yew was confronted with these criticisms, he never apologized. Western democracies don't need to lecture us, he'd say. Look at the results. And on one occasion he added, if every politician is just chasing votes, who's going to make the right decisions? You might sit there and say this is unacceptable. And I agree with many people's ethical objections here, I'll say it plainly. But as an economic historian, I also have to ask this. If this approach hadn't been taken, could the Singapore we know today have existed at all? By the time the 1980s came around, Singapore needed to move to a different phase entirely. Manufacturing built on cheap labor could no longer compete with China and the rest of Asia. And here came one of Singapore's boldest moves. The government deliberately pushed minimum wages upward. We need to stop being cheap, said Lee Kuan Yew. Being cheap isn't a competitive advantage, it's a trap. So what came instead? Finance, technology, biomedical research, legal services,